We're going to be seeing a lot more written about AI and about how it can be a security sinkhole and ways that you can prevent that from happening. I think we're going to continue to need better AI security tools.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Shift. I'm your host, Darren Michael, and today we're joined by David Strom, the owner of Strom.com, which is one of the earliest and most respected voices in enterprise technology journalism and cybersecurity commentary. David's work has appeared in publications like Network World, IT World, and CSO Online, and he spent his career breaking down complex technology trends into clear, actionable insights that leaders can actually use. David, it's great to have you here. Where are you calling in from today?
Thanks, Darren. I'm living in St. Louis, and that's where I happen to be at the moment.
Well, that's great. And before we get rolling, I always like to make sure that these conversations are relaxed as possible. So, for those of you first joining in, this is just a casual conversation. There's nothing formal or overly polished. We want the ums and the thinking. And if there's ever something that you'd rather want to change later, that's where we say no way, because we want this to be real and live and not overly produced. Our goal today is to simply have an authentic chat about what's going on in today's world of cybersecurity and digital transformation. And you're here helping us talk about it today. So, for those of you joining, we're going to start with David's background and how he chose to launch his company. From there, we're going to start looking at the cybersecurity and technology landscape in regards to what's changing, what's breaking, and what's next. And then we'll wrap it up looking into the future and maybe dig into a specific challenge that we see going on with companies right now. Our podcasts tend to be about 30 to 40 minutes. And so we're going to continue to explore our ongoing digital leaders of owners and C-suites, all focused on the new age of AI, automation, and cybersecurity. So, without a doubt, let's get going. David, I hope that introduction did you well. And let's just start out a little bit about your background.
So I've been involved in technology since the earliest days that personal computers arrived on the scene in the 1980s. I was very fortunate to time that very precisely. And I started out working in technology with supporting end user computing, working for the first in house computer stores, if you will, for the US government. And then I went on to work for a software company that was involved in uh, porting its software that was on mainframe computers onto the first Apple II computers and then the IBM PC. So very, very early days, very primitive PCs. My first job in tech journalism was when I started working at PC Week, which is now unfortunately called eWeek. And I was one of the first editors that was hired there that had a technical practitioner background as opposed to a journalism school graduate.
And with such a diverse career from being a journalist to an editor and now running your own media platform, how did Strom.com come to life and what's your main focus for it today?
Well, it's funny you talk about Strom.com like it's a living, breathing entity. It's just a domain name, right? Back in the early days, you didn't even have to buy it. You would just we send a request to an email address, and a few seconds later, the request would be honored, and you'd have that domain name. So there were really wild times. People were grabbing domains right and left. There's a very early infamous story where one of the journalists acquired McDonald's.com and then tried to give it to McDonald's, and they refused initially because they had no idea what a domain name was. That was a mistake that cost them some money later on. But I wanted to go off on my own. I was running a magazine called Network Computing, which is still around today in digital format. And I had the entrepreneurial itch to have my own freelance journalism business. And so I started that back in 92, and it's been many years since then.
And so, how hard was it to transition from, paper copy into the digital world?
Well, that didn't really occur until I would say later in the 1990s. The web really wasn't uh, introduced to the public until I would say 94 or 95. And it wasn't that hard for me to do it because all the work that I had been doing up until that point was being produced digitally. I mean, I had one of the early, notebook computers. I was involved with email very early on, before it was easy to have internet email. You had to go through a variety of mechanisms to get on the internet when you were not a research company or an academic or a government entity. Those are the only people that were really on the internet. My work was actually being produced digitally. I was working remotely when I put Network Computing Magazine together. We had the first remote editorial staff. We had the first digital production line. We were producing our printed magazine using Quark, which at that time was very early technology, and it would fall apart very easily. So that part of it wasn't hard. The hard part was the funding model, because these B2B IT publications like PC Week and InfoWorld and Computer World were charging a lot of money for print advertising. And when the print part went away, they couldn't charge those same rates for digital advertising. So their staffs, by necessity, had to shrink.
Okay. So what would you say that the main services you offer today are?
Today, I offer three basic services. So I write articles that go up typically on publication blogs or on vendors' digital properties. I write longer pieces like white papers or reports. And I also do narrated video screencasts, which are me talking. You don't see me, you just see the product, and I show what a product does. And those are very useful because in 3 or 4 minutes, you can replace a call with a marketing person or an engineer that would probably take 40 or 50 minutes. And a potential customer could see right away whether this was appropriate or not appropriate for them to use in their enterprise.
All right. Well, that actually kind of goes into the next question I had for you. But as the owner, what does a typical day look like for you when you're working through leadership and working on figuring out the analysis on how to make effective videos?
Well, there's no typical day. I mean, that's what I like about my job. Every day is different. Every day, you're reacting to some news event, or you're participating in some call where you're learning about a product or learning about what a company is doing with a product. You're doing research with talking to, your sources, trying to figure out what the vendor says is not 100% true. I know this comes as a shock to you that vendors actually stretch the truth on their products. We won't say lie, but they oftentimes don't give an accurate portrayal. And so part of my job is figuring out what works and what doesn't work. There's always cases where products aren't appropriate in particular situations. And whether they're edge cases or major fails is what determines whether a product succeeds or doesn't.
I was going to say that, when we're looking at what makes things fail, what do you think are the most common mistakes companies do?
They don't test a product completely, or in some cases nowadays, they put it up online and they wait for somebody to tell them when it falls over, which is kind of scary. If you're a large company with thousands of people using something, or you could be a company like Salesforce that buys a company and says, well, we have an idea for a better product, but we're not going to introduce it for another year. So basically, you're on your own. Which, I mean, it's Salesforce. They're a multi-billion-dollar company. It's crazy that that behavior is tolerated now. I think also that people will use products in new and interesting ways. They're completely unpredictable. And that's the beauty and the horror of the internet all rolled into one. And a better example is AI. It can be either, what I call the Skynet scenario, where the robots take over control and humanity becomes an annoyance, or it can become, the next cure for cancer. And there's no way to predict which way that's going to go.
My current prediction is it's both at the moment.
It's both, yes.
Yeah, we'll do it all. We're gonna do all or nothing. No half-assing it. We're going all full in.
Right.
So, so when it comes to looking at cybersecurity and technology, it has evolved rapidly over the past few years. So, what major shifts or trends are you seeing right now that stood out to you?
Well, I think the role of a network of computers used to be very important. Networking was a very late development with the personal computer era because the computer was so personal. When you got a computer on your desk, you didn't want to share anything. It was yours. It was your creation, your work product, your workflow. So now we don't even think about it because we assume that the computer is going to be connected to the internet and the world. We wouldn't think of putting a computer just sitting alone in a room without any possibility of networking. And so that's a very hard set of circumstances for security people to wrap their heads around because so much of security is figuring out ways to penetrate to your particular desktop, not because you're a target or because you clicked on some phishing email or because of some other circumstances. So no one has a standalone computer any longer. And because online is available everywhere, now everyone assumes that it is always there. And that's not always the case. You may have crappy Wi-Fi, or you may be in a secure room which is deliberately kept offline, like at a nuclear power plant or at something like that. So the different scenarios with the fact that anyone can reach out and touch you is a real challenge for security. And the fact that the other thing is that it's very ephemeral. Security changes by the second almost. Somebody can come up with a new way to leverage their way into your piece of software that you may have thought was secure in the past.
And I think that speed actually leads into AI. So, in your opinion, do you think the pace of AI integration has outstripped the ability for security teams to adapt and keep up?
Oh yeah, it's very difficult to keep up because particularly when you connect multiple AI models together and the bots are talking to each other. It's hard to anticipate what they're going to find. And in some cases they make up stuff, and in some cases they find real vulnerabilities.
And so, especially because you've been covering this industry since the early days of networking, how would you say today's environment compares to where it was decades ago?
Well, decades ago you had people who were real experts in a very particular area, and they could be confident of their expertise. Nowadays, I don't think that's possible. You have to be a jack of all trades. You have to anticipate where the next challenge is going to come from, and in some cases, just roll with the punches.
Are there any specific suggestions you have for people to proactively predict?
I think you have to keep an open mind. I think you have to also constantly evaluate. If we're talking cybersecurity now, you have to evaluate your tool set regularly. You can't just say, well, I got this firewall or I got this particular endpoint protection device. And it was good for me a year ago. It's still good for me. Things evolve very quickly, and you have to be constantly on the lookout for new stuff.
Okay. And so let's focus on, even though you don't call it a self-standing entity, but Strom.com and your business as the owner, what's been working really well for you and your publications and your readers right now? Like, can you give an example of that?
Uh, sure. So those screencast videos that I mentioned were a good example of that. That's been something that I started about 15 years ago, and it's still helpful. And I'm surprised more people aren't doing that. I would hope that I would be out of business because more people were just figuring out how to do it, but that's not been the case. I think also that there are people that appreciate expertise and depth and quality, but those aren't necessarily the people that are willing to pay for that. That's always been a classic economics case where the beneficiaries and the cost bearers are two separate universes. And I think we've seen that movement apart in that area.
Okay. So then what continues to be the most frustrating or challenging part of the landscape?
I think because you create content, people assume that you can get it for free because AI can create content for pennies now. And whether that content has any value, has any actionable intelligence, is a different story. And I think the consumer of that content knows implicitly whether they're reading something that's of value or not within the first couple of sentences. So why the producers of that content haven't made it better is still a mystery to me.
So are you seeing certain misconceptions in the market that's making those types of challenges harder to solve?
I think people assume that because they can create, AI slop easily, that it's going to drive value to their properties. And remember when my background, we're working at PC Week and Network Computing magazines. We had editorial staffs, dozens of people. We had a copy desk of 4 or 5 people that would do nothing but edit copy. I mean, how often do you pick up an average daily newspaper and within seconds spot typos? I was reading, our Post Dispatch newspaper here in St. Louis. The quality of the copy has really gone downhill. I mean, I'm not a proofreader by trade, but when you can spot a typo in a headline, that's pretty bad.
Well, yeah, especially in the headline. But I've also learned that sometimes they do that purposely because it stands out. If everything is grammatically correct, the typo will make people see that first. And so I'm curious to your opinion at whether or not it's worth having something different, even if it's purposely incorrect, to grab the attention, or does that invalidate the value of what's in the article?
I think that's nonsense, Darren. I think if you have things that are easily spotted as wrong, that doesn't increase your value, that decreases your value. It just shows that you're sloppy. And some of the websites that I've worked for over the years, we posted things first and then we would edit them later because we wanted to be up first with something. And I think taking a few extra minutes and at least finding the obvious problems. And sometimes it's inconsistencies. You want somebody with another brain looking at your logic and your reasoning because you may have some flaws in there that you just didn't think about. Not everybody's perfect.
So, with all of your industry experience, right, you have interviewed and advised countless CISOs. What do you think most companies are still underestimating about cyber risk today?
They fail to quantify it in terms of their business impact. If one breach can cost a company millions of dollars that they could have avoided by spending, let's say, $100,000 in a product, that's a pretty obvious business decision. They will make that decision after the breach quite quickly because they realized, how wrong they were. But before the breach and knowing that you're going to be breached, everybody is going to have a breach at some point or another in the future. It's just the nature of the business. So why not put in place relatively inexpensive protective measures? Especially if you know you have a weakness because you have the way that you've constructed your databases or your servers or whatever. Why not put that in place? I mean, I can't tell you the number of readers that I hear from that said, we put this product up on Monday and Thursday we had someone attempt to breach, but was caught by this product because it was up literally days in advance. I mean, that's a scary thought. I mean, glad it happened, not the other way. But still, there's a lot of people that haven't made those decisions.
And why do you think they don't make those decisions?
Because they don't understand the risk reward equation. They don't look at it in the business context. They're lost in their little technical world, and they can't communicate the value of that. If I'm a CISO and I'm not talking the language of money when I go before a board of directors or before an executive suite, I'm not talking the right language. It'd be like I was speaking in Swahili to an audience that doesn't know that language.
So when you look at your own company, what metrics are you most focused on improving?
My own company? Well, it's just me here.
Right.
So part of my metrics is, am I having a good time? Am I learning interesting things? Am I doing the same thing over and over again? That was one of the reasons why I left network computing and started my own business, because publishing a monthly magazine after a while, it's pretty boring. You assign the stories, you assign the artwork, the work comes in, you edit them, you produce the pages. It's a fairly linear workflow. You have to have the magazine go on press on a certain date, which means you have to have all the ads ready, all the copy ready. Everything has to be in place on, at 8 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, like we had for PC Week. But, with my own business, it's a lot more fluid. It's what can I learn today? Where can I go in the world that's going to give me information? I mean, it's incredible now that you and I are talking to each other across what 800-mile distance. It could be 8,000 miles. It's the same thing. We accept the fact that we can dial in remotely to just about any place at any time, and whether we learn anything from that connection is another story. But I remember getting on a plane for a client, because that was the only way to get the work done.
Right.
My editor, for example, at CSO Online lives in Australia. So I have to accept the fact that I'm going to get emails from her in the middle of the night, and she's going to send me emails in the middle of my night, because we're off by whatever it is, 12, 13 hours.
And that's kind of interesting from that partnership model. So how did you figure out an editor over in Australia compared to someone local?
Well, it wasn't my choice. I was working for this publication, and they, eventually they changed staff, and I started with someone in the States, and then they moved me to this person in Australia. So it wasn't like I said, well, I'm not going to work for someone in Australia. I'm not going to, it doesn't. She's actually very good, but it's just the way the business works right now. Everybody is so remote. It doesn't really matter. My daughter works for a company that has 900 people. They have 0 offices in the United States. Everybody works remote.
It's a good way to increase profits too, because you don't have to deal with the brick and mortar expenses of not only the building itself, but repairs, electricity, and everything else.
Right. The key, though, is having managers that are comfortable in their own skin and who know how to work with remote staffs. I mean, I had a lot of pushback from my publisher when I started network computing, and we had easily half of our editorial staff was not in our main offices in New York. And, I learned how to do that when I was at PC Week. And so it was only natural for me to continue to hire the best people no matter where they are. And I think that's the key, is if you have people that are good at what they do and you have a defined workflow and you have managers that are comfortable with not having to see a body in a seat, look out over their empire and see if the person is sitting there. They may be playing, some video game. They may not be working, but they're in their seats. I think that's easy, but run an editorial operation. If you have an editor that's not producing copy, then something is wrong. It's pretty easy to measure
that. That's very true. So thinking about that, because we've obviously gone from in office to remote, and companies kind of battle back and forth with that. Where do you sit on the ideal structure? Is it a hybrid? Is it fully in office, fully remote?
I think some people are better off in an office environment, and depending on how far away they are from that office, could benefit from at least some part of their week going in and working there in person. I think you have to match it up with the person. You have to have. This is where I think HR has fallen down. We don't really have the right skills in HR to vet remote people properly. Look at what's happening with all these North Korean spies that are getting jobs in IT organizations around the world because they misrepresent themselves. And, even cybersecurity companies have been caught flat-footed by hiring these imposters. So I think it's important to vet people more carefully and make sure they are who they say they are when you're going to hire
them. Okay. So then let's look into the future. How do you see the industry changing over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, certainly we're going to be seeing a lot more written about AI and about how it can be a security sinkhole and ways that you can prevent that from happening. I think we're going to continue to need better AI security tools. And, automation, as we talked about, is a two-edged sword. And so to the extent that you can help rather than hurt things is important. I think as software as a service and as AI continues to invade the enterprise digital infrastructure, we're going to see more products that combine those and that make them useful and are self-healing. I think that's important. It's great to have automation, but if the automation creates more problems than it solves, it's not very good automation. So to the extent that you could use the AI tech to learn about your weaknesses and actually fix things, I think is a great innovation.
When you continue to look into your future for your own self and what you're trying to accomplish, what are your goals in the next 6 to 12 months?
I don't know. To continue to find interesting vendors to work with and publications that still have an editorial budget that want me to write for them. Those are good goals.
Are there any new projects or areas of focus that you're excited about trying to tap into?
Well, there's always something new. Every day you see a new product announcement. The question is it worthwhile? Is it something that I can explain its value? I've got a vendor call in a few minutes after we're done here. And I was first contacted by them over a year ago. And that shows you that the pace of good software development still takes time. Yes, you can be incredibly productive with AI and you can code up a storm like nobody's business. But to really input value into the tool is still tough.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm a big believer of AI helps augment, but not necessarily replace, right? If you can produce more, it still requires that human touch to make it sellable, or at least to understand and consume the feedback.
Right. So here you're recording this podcast, and you're also using an AI tool to produce a transcript. So my question for you, have you ever gone back to those transcripts and found something of value that you missed during the real-time interaction?
Yes.
But it's a lot more work. Is it worth the amount of time to read through that transcript carefully? Or are you looking for, say, well, Strom said something at minute 13, I want to go check and make sure that it was, what I thought he said.
Well, there's definitely tricks of the trades, like writing down timestamps of key moments, but that is where AI or summary tools can definitely help because it can take that transcript and at least give you an overall summary. And so then from there, you're able to make calls of at least areas to go focus to where if you had to do it entirely manually, you're having to read through, let's say 30 minutes to an hour of a script. And obviously that takes a lot of time.
Right. So, but I think there are people that just post that transcript verbatim.
Right. Well, and I think you see that most of the time on social media when they have, the text overlay, it's not usually proofread because there's almost always mistakes somewhere in that.
Right.
Yeah.
So there you have a case where a tool can either add or subtract value, and there's still a lot of human interaction and integration. That's my point.
I agree. Yeah. That's a dance between the two for sure. So when you talk about trying to find publishing houses that continue to have a budget for editorial, is that kind of like the biggest thing that's holding you back from getting more gigs? Or is there something else that if you had a magic wand to fix the one thing, what would it be?
Well, you have to remember, I came from an era where editorial budgets were flowing like water. I mean, at network computing, I had $1 million a year editorial budget for the publication, to pay for the people to do that work. I don't think there's any trade publication that has anywhere near that budget, even if it's all freelance now. So there's been a tremendous contraction. I mean, when I first started in the industry in the 80s, we had a stack of magazines every week that were, this high, that would come to my desk. And so part of the joy or the challenge was going through all that paper and trying to stay ahead of what everybody else was reading from the same pubs, because we had end users that were reading the pubs that IT people were reading.
And I'm assuming that's going to continue to shrink as technology continues to become more and more mainstream.
Right. But, mainstream means that you have inexperienced people that are using a portion of a product, but they may not know that the 80% that they're not using is available. I mean, how many people run spreadsheets now? Almost everyone knows what a spreadsheet is and knows that they can add up columns of numbers. But do they know that they can do linear programming on it? Do they know that they can, create all sorts of financial modeling tools? There's probably 500 functions in your average spreadsheet. Most people know 6 of them.
Right. Yeah, just enough to do their daily work. So, what is
Right.
your trick in finding the companies that still have the budget?
Just a lot of shoe leather or digital shoe leather. I'm not actually walking this pavement looking for it.
Okay. So, as we wrap up, do you have any last words for our audience of things you recommend for them to be successful in the awareness in cybersecurity?
I think don't take things at face value. Don't take what the vendor says without doing some further investigation. Understand the particular peculiarities of your environment and make sure that you really can map out your digital infrastructure and its changing nature accurately. It's a lot of people, I bring in a server or set up some software as a service product, and I don't tell IT. It's a shadow, the shadow IT has become the mainstream now. Back in the day when I worked in companies' end user computing departments, IT recommended software, and that was the only place that you could buy software. There weren't you couldn't connect anything online and download stuff. So we've come a long ways.
I agree with that for sure. So, David, I appreciate all of your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've given our listeners a ton to think about when it comes to, we can even call it cybersecurity storytelling and the awareness of how it's all evolving. For anyone that wants to keep up with David's work, you can head on over to strom.com. You can find links in the description for him. And on his website, you'll find David's latest articles, resources, and commentary there. So, David, thank you again for joining us on The Digital Shift. And thank you to everyone tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss future conversations with today's top innovators in cybersecurity, technology, and AI. David, thank you again.
Thanks, Darren. Pleasure to be here.
Hey there. It's Darren from The Digital Shift. I wanted to take a moment to thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to check out the links in the description to learn even more information of everything we went over today. But if you enjoyed this podcast, then you are absolutely going to love this one. And if you're looking to look deeper into the technology that we go over in these videos, then go ahead and check out this one here. Regardless of which one you pick, you're going to walk away with something new. As always, I'll talk to you in the next one and keep being awesome.